we are probably in the most challenging environment from a geopolitical standpoint that we have seen since the end of the Second World War. There are a variety of reasons for that. We have a number of clearly very dissatisfied powers, such as Russia, China, Iran, Turkey. We have the developing world having endured multiple shocks from the financial crisis and COVID. The developing world has a food issue that is looming. I don't want to be a doom and gloom sayer. It's already enough that I think everyone who's watching television understands that we're very much in uncharted waters. I would begin by saying that the vast majority of mankind is experiencing gold at all-time highs. And even against the almighty dollar, gold has performed extremely well. So whereas I'm used to people saying at certain inflection points, why hasn't gold done better? I think the truth is that gold has done a spectacular job of preserving people's wealth. Pretty much every Indian who's owned gold since the dawn of mankind has found that he's been able to preserve his wealth in that fashion. Similarly, the Chinese, similarly, the British. I could go on, but essentially gold is in a bull market against all currencies, and in that I include the dollar. If you take a look at a long-term price chart of gold, you'll see against the dollar that gold is consolidating and coiling for the next up leg in the bull market, the one that will take it convincingly past 2000 and to the higher equilibrium range that I see. That's in dollar terms. The truth is that gold is rising in a global environment. So in other words, if we do talk about the BRICS, if we do understand that the US dollar is the home currency of only roughly 5% of the world, then you have to look at things through a different lens. And if you do believe that we are dealing in a different world, then the truth is that gold is poised to probably be the safest asset out there. So there are a number of myths about gold. And I'll give you an anecdote from my own life experience that highlights just how the perception and the reality of those myths play out. In November of 2007, my family sold what was then probably the fastest growing privately owned natural gas producer in the United States. Timing was extremely fortunate. The price of oil had hit $100. The same people who were telling me when we created an energy company a number of years earlier, and the price of oil was at $18, that it was going to go back to a normative 12 to 15, maybe even under 10 again. And I saw it going to 100. And so when it did hit 100, we'd made 100 times our money through exploration success and rising hydrocarbon prices, and we decided to sell. Now, when we received that wire transfer, there were several things which we need to remember. First, dollar-euro was 146. The price of gold had a 6 handle, 600 something. The price of gold is nearly triple, and dollar-euro is at parity. The price of oil was at around $100 a barrel. It's now $80, $85 a barrel. Again, price of gold was about a third of where it is today. There was no inflation, and yet gold tripled. So when you look at the various mythologies that people harbor about gold, that you need inflation, it's not true. That you need a weak dollar, not true. That it's just a commodity like oil, again, not true. And you also have to take into account that central banks at that time were not buyers of gold, whereas now they are. And if there's one thing that we've learned is that the central bankers, more than anyone else, are the equivalent of insider buying.
Exactly.
Because no one knows better than they do the weakness, the fragility, the counterparty risk that they have in all the other assets that they've been acquiring, in many cases under duress, because we're in uncharted waters in terms of monetary policy and in terms of being able to keep the global economy afloat. So from all these aspects, I look at gold and I say that it's the best myth buster that there is in the world. And again, people will say, well, how come it hasn't done better? I always hear this before gold is going to make a major push upwards. When this consolidation is over, when this pullback is over, and it is a pullback within a bull market, that price chart of gold is wildly bullish. When that ends, I think that we're going to see the next breakthrough, a lot of which, by the way, is going to be lubricated by the crypto narrative. Because what the crypto narrative has done is it's made a lot of the arguments that I used to have to make on the virtue of owning an asset that isn't someone else's liability, owning a currency that can't be printed by fiat. It's made that argument redundant. Everyone now accepts that. Hence the moniker that crypto was given of gold 2.0. Well, turns out that gold 1.0 is pretty great. I suppose that we always have to remember that those people who are bullish on gold, despite the fact that, as I've just said, it works well without inflation, it works well against commodities, it works well against the dollar, we're still called bugs, gold bugs. I think it's probably the only asset in the world where when you are bullish, you are referred to as an insect. And so it's not a question of whether or not I like to put gold into a box or that I resent other people doing it.
Right.
It's that they're demonstrably incorrect historically. We understand that we're looking at a world that is wildly challenging. But those who are on the front lines of the financial markets, such as central bankers, also understand that we've now crossed into a certain kind of twilight zone. If someone had said last year that a great deal of Russia's foreign currency could be sterilized just like that,
right?
People would have said, well, that's probably a step that won't be taken by other authorities because it sets a precedent. So many precedents have been broken over the last decade that we should understand that the central banks are looking around and they're saying, what is it that when you own it does not represent something that can be seized, that will still maintain value, and after all is historically the most important reserve asset that central banks owned up until the dollar was taken off that standard and was considered to be as good as gold. I don't believe the Chinese are telling the truth as to what they really own. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but if you're accumulating a position in a stock, you don't tell someone every time you're buying blocks of shares. All that does is create front running. So if you're the Chinese, do you really want to advertise to the world that you're in the market? You suppress that information. You keep it as low-key as possible. You disperse the holdings that you've obviously been acquiring into different pockets so that when you do have to make disclosures about what you own, they seem to be relatively small and modest in terms of the increases. China is the largest producer of gold in the world. They're also one of the largest importers of gold in the world. So that has to be going somewhere. So unless the Chinese retail market is far more developed in its infrastructure and plumbing than I'm aware of,
Right.
it's going into the official sector. And if I were the Chinese, I wouldn't be advertising that. And I certainly wouldn't be going to Goldman Sachs and saying, here's an order for 10 million ounces, 20 million ounces of gold. You wouldn't do that. You would try to accumulate it as elegantly as possible. Now, if someone were to ask me, if Russia went to China and said, would you be willing to buy all of our gold reserves? We need the cash. That's a check I think the Chinese would write if they haven't already written it.